October 15, 2024. Margaret Chen found the girl at 2:47 p.m., third stall from the left, sobbing into her small hands. The locket around Emma's neck stopped Margaret cold. Sterling silver, tiny rose engraving, exactly like the one she'd buried with her daughter 23 years ago. Emma looked up with eyes that knew too much. "You're the lady from my dreams," she whispered. "You used to sing me the butterfly song." Margaret had never sung to any child at school, ever. But she knew that song. She'd hummed it during 9 months of pregnancy, whispered it during labor, sang it one last time at a graveside no one else attended. The principal appeared in the doorway. His face went white when he saw them together. "Mrs. Chen," he stammered, "step away from the child." That's when Margaret realized someone had been watching, someone had been waiting. And everything she thought she knew about Emma Martinez was about to shatter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward Emma, but Principal Davidson stepped fully into the restroom, his bulk filling the narrow doorway. Behind him, she glimpsed the school nurse, Mrs. Patterson, hovering in the hallway with a clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. "There's been a misunderstanding," Davidson said, his voice carrying that forced calm Margaret had heard him use with angry parents. "Emma needs to come with us now." The 8-year-old pressed herself deeper into the corner of the stall, her fingers clutching the locket so tightly her knuckles went white. Margaret noticed how the chain left a thin red line against Emma's pale neck, too tight, as if it had been fastened by nervous hands. "She's upset," Margaret said, not moving from her crouch beside the stall. "Let me talk to her." "That's not appropriate," Mrs. Chen Davidson's tone sharpened. "You know the protocols." Protocol. 31 years of teaching, and Margaret knew every rule, every procedure. Don't be alone with a distressed child. Always involve administration. Call the parents first. But something about Davidson's insistence felt wrong, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. Emma's whisper cut through the tension. "She knows the words to my song." Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't sung the butterfly song since Sarah. Her daughter's name still felt like swallowing glass after all these years. Sarah, who lived for 18 months before the meningitis took her. Sarah, who Margaret had raised alone in a studio apartment above the old bakery, surviving on welfare checks and sheer determination after keeping the pregnancy everyone told her to terminate. "What song, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. Emma's voice was barely audible. "Butterfly, butterfly, dance on the breeze." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the stall door to steady herself. That song, she'd made it up during those long nights walking the floors with a colicky baby, desperate to soothe them both. She'd never written it down, never taught it to anyone. When Sarah died, Margaret buried the song with her. "Where did you learn that?" Margaret whispered. "The lady in my dreams. She has your voice." Davidson moved closer, his footsteps echoing off the tile walls. "Emma, your mother is waiting in my office. She's very worried." But Emma shook her head violently. "She's not my mother. She's scared of me. They're all scared." Margaret studied the child's face, the sharp cheekbones, the way her left eyebrow arched higher than the right, features that tugged at something buried deep in her memory. "Who's scared, Emma?" "The people who brought me here. They said I couldn't talk about the dreams anymore. They said, 'Enough.'" Davidson's voice cracked like a whip. "Mrs. Chen, step back immediately, or I'll have to call security." Security. At an elementary school, for a teacher comforting a crying child, Margaret felt the first prickle of real fear. In 3 decades at Riverside Elementary, she'd never seen Davidson this agitated. He was sweating despite the October chill, and his hands kept flexing at his sides. "What's really going on here?" Margaret stood slowly, positioning herself between Davidson and Emma. "You're overstepping boundaries, Margaret." The use of her first name felt like a warning. The Martinez family has expressed concerns about certain teachers showing inappropriate interest in their daughter. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Inappropriate interest, the kind of words that ended careers, destroyed reputations. Margaret felt 31 years of spotless service crumbling beneath her feet. But Emma's small hand slipped into hers, and Margaret felt something impossible, a jolt of recognition so strong it made her gasp. Not just familiarity, connection, as if every cell in her body suddenly remembered something her mind had forgotten. "She's not lying," Emma said, looking up at Margaret with those two knowing eyes. "You can feel it too, can't you? The remembering?" Margaret's vision blurred. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. This was impossible. Children didn't reincarnate. Dead daughters didn't come back. She was a rational woman, a teacher who believed in facts and lesson plans and the orderly progression of phonics workbooks. But Sarah's locket hung around this stranger's neck, and Sarah's song spilled from her lips, and Margaret's body recognized what her mind refused to accept. Let go of her hand. Mrs. Chen Davidson's voice had turned ice cold. Now, Margaret looked down at their joined hands, her weathered fingers intertwined with Emma's small ones. The child's pulse thrummed against her palm, steady and warm and alive. So alive. Behind Davidson, Mrs. Patterson whispered something urgent into her phone. Margaret caught fragments. "Situation escalating. Need immediate." Yes, she's with the child now. They'd been watching, waiting for this moment. But why? Margaret squeezed Emma's hand gently, then released it. "I'm going to figure this out," she murmured. Emma nodded, tears still streaming down her cheeks. "I know you will, Mama. You always promise to find me." The word, Mama, hit Margaret like a sledgehammer to the chest, because Sarah had said those exact words, in that exact voice, the night before she died. The world tilted sideways. Margaret gripped the cold metal of the bathroom stall, her knuckles white against the industrial gray paint. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel surreal and dreamlike. Emma's words, "Mama," echoed in the sterile space, bouncing off tile walls that had witnessed 31 years of Margaret's carefully constructed life. "Come along, Emma." Davidson's voice cut through Margaret's shock, but it sounded distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Your family is waiting." Family. The word felt foreign in Margaret's mouth as she watched Emma reluctantly step forward. The child moved like she was walking through water, each step heavy with reluctance. The locket caught the harsh bathroom lighting, winking gold against her small chest. Sarah's locket, impossible as it seemed. Margaret had built her entire adult life around the absence of that locket. She'd searched for it frantically in those awful days after Sarah's death, tearing apart their tiny apartment, checking hospital rooms, even calling the funeral home in desperate hope. It had simply vanished, along with everything else that mattered. "Mrs. Chen?" Mrs. Patterson's voice pulled her back to the present. The nurse stood in the doorway now, clipboard forgotten, her usually composed face creased with something that might have been concern or calculation. "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." Pale. Margaret almost laughed. She felt like she was dissolving, becoming translucent, as if 39 years of careful forgetting were unraveling thread by thread. The bathroom walls seemed to press closer, filled with the ghosts of all the children she'd comforted here over the decades, scraped knees and hurt feelings, forgotten lunches and playground betrayals. Simple problems with simple solutions. Nothing like this. "I'm fine," Margaret managed. Though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears, she watched Emma's small figure disappear through the doorway, flanked by Davidson's imposing presence. The child didn't look back, but Margaret caught the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way her head hung like a flower too heavy for its stem. The bathroom fell silent, except for the persistent drip of a leaky faucet, a sound Margaret had reported to maintenance countless times over the years. Drip, drip, drip. Like a metronome counting the seconds of her unraveling certainty. She moved to the sink and stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. 58 years old, with silver threading through her brown hair and lines carved by decades of smiling at other people's children. Sensible cardigan, practical shoes, the uniform of a woman who had chosen safety over risk, routine over chaos. A woman who read mystery novels but lived a life of careful predictability. The face staring back at her looked like a stranger. Margaret splashed cold water on her cheeks, feeling the shock of it against her heated skin. The faucet squeaked as she turned it off, another small maintenance issue in a building full of them. Riverside Elementary was old, built in the 1970s with that institutional efficiency that prioritized function over beauty. Beige walls, linoleum floors, windows that painted everything in harsh rectangular light. Home for 31 years. She thought of her classroom 2 floors up, where tomorrow's lesson plans waited in neat stacks on her desk. Reading comprehension worksheets for Charlotte's Web, arithmetic problems involving apples and oranges, a science unit on butterfly migration, normal third-grade concerns for normal third-grade children. Emma Martinez wasn't normal. The thought came unbidden, and Margaret tried to push it away. She was a rational woman, a teacher trained to deal with facts and evidence. Children had active imaginations. They confused dreams with reality, invented elaborate stories, said things that seemed profound but were really just coincidence. But the locket... Margaret's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where her own chain held only a small silver cross, a gift from the church ladies who'd helped her through those dark months after Sarah's death. Practical women who'd brought casseroles and quiet comfort, who'd never once suggested that losing a child was anything but devastating and final. Dead daughters didn't come back. The bathroom door swung open, startling her from her thoughts. Jenny Walsh, the kindergarten teacher, bustled in with her usual cheerful energy. "Oh, Margaret, there you are. We were wondering..." Jenny stopped mid-sentence, her smile fading. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. If only it were that simple. Ghosts were memory, ephemeral and safe in their distance. This was something else entirely. Something warm and breathing and terrifyingly real. "I'm fine," Margaret said again, wondering when those words had become her default lie. "Just a difficult morning." Jenny's expression softened with the easy sympathy of someone who'd spent years dealing with childhood dramas. Third graders can be a handful. Remember when Tommy Morrison convinced half his class they could fly if they believed hard enough? Normal problems, normal solutions. Margaret nodded and managed what she hoped was a reassuring smile, but her thoughts remained fixed on a small girl with 2 knowing eyes and impossible knowledge of a song that died with Sarah 39 years ago. She followed Jenny out of the bathroom, leaving behind the dripping faucet and the echo of a word that had just shattered her carefully ordered world: "Mama." The hallway stretched before them like a tunnel, lined with construction-papered jack-o'-lanterns and student artwork that suddenly looked garish under the flickering fluorescent lights. Margaret's sensible shoes squeaked against the waxed linoleum as she walked beside Jenny, but her mind remained trapped in that bathroom stall, replaying Emma's voice. "You always promised to find me." Sarah had been 18 months old when she died, barely talking, still stumbling on unsteady legs, obsessed with a stuffed rabbit named Honey. She'd never made promises about finding anyone. The words were impossible. And yet... "The Halloween party planning committee," Jenny was saying, her voice a cheerful blur. "We need someone to coordinate the cookie donations. And you're so good with organization." Margaret nodded automatically, but her attention caught on something else entirely. Through the glass windows of the main office, she could see Davidson's broad back as he stood behind his desk. Emma sat in one of the visitor chairs, dwarfed by its size, while a woman Margaret didn't recognize paced behind her. The woman had dark hair pulled severely back and wore an expensive-looking black coat that seemed out of place in their small-town elementary school. "Margaret?" Jenny's voice sharpened with concern. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Staring. You've been acting strange all morning." Margaret forced herself to look away from the office windows, but not before she caught something that made her stomach drop. The woman in the black coat had her hands on Emma's shoulders, not comforting but restraining, and Emma was trying to pull away, her small body rigid with distress. "I need to check on something," Margaret said abruptly, leaving Jenny standing in the hallway with her mouth half open. Margaret's classroom was on the 2nd floor, but instead of heading to the stairwell, she found herself moving toward the office. Through the glass, she could hear raised voices, Davidson's low rumble and the woman's sharp tones cutting through it. "Told you this couldn't happen again. The medication is supposed to prevent..." "She hasn't taken it today," Davidson interrupted. "Mrs. Martinez insisted on waiting until..." "This is exactly what we discussed. The episodes are getting worse, not better." Episodes. Margaret pressed closer to the glass, her teacher's instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. In 31 years, she'd seen every kind of family dysfunction, every variety of childhood trauma. But this felt different, clinical, cold. Emma's voice cut through the adult conversation, clear and desperate. "I want to go home, my real home." The woman's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "This is your home, Emma. We've been through this." "No." Emma's voice grew stronger. "My real home had yellow walls and music boxes and—" The woman's hand moved to her purse, withdrawing a small brown bottle. Pills rattled like tiny bones as she shook one into her palm. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. She'd seen this before. Not here, not in her safe school environment, but in the stories that made the news. Children drugged into compliance, families that weren't families, situations too horrific for primetime television. Without thinking, she pushed through the office door. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "Emma left her reading folder in my classroom. I thought she might need it." It was a lie. Emma wasn't even in her class, but it got her inside the room. Up close, the woman looked even more severe, with pale eyes that seemed to calculate the threat level of everything they saw. Her hand had moved quickly to close around the pill bottle, but not quickly enough. "Mrs. Martinez," Davidson said, his voice tight with barely concealed irritation, "this is Mrs. Chen, one of our third-grade teachers." The woman who was supposedly Emma's mother didn't look anything like her. Where Emma was delicate and fair, this woman was angular and dark. Where Emma's eyes held depth and old sadness, this woman's gaze was flat and predatory. "Emma isn't in my class officially," Margaret continued, "but she wandered in yesterday during reading time. She's remarkably advanced for her age." Emma's head snapped up, and their eyes met across the office. In that moment, Margaret saw something that stopped her heart: recognition. Not the vague familiarity of a child who'd seen her in the hallways, but the deep soul-level recognition of someone who'd been waiting. "The butterfly book," Emma whispered. "You were reading about butterflies." Margaret hadn't been reading about butterflies. She'd been planning next week's science unit, yes, but the materials were still locked in her desk drawer. No one could have seen them, except 39 years ago, on the last night of Sarah's life, Margaret had read to her daughter from a picture book about monarch butterflies. Sarah had been feverish, restless, and the book was the only thing that calmed her. Margaret had read it over and over, her voice growing hoarse, until Sarah finally fell into the sleep from which she never woke. The book had been destroyed in a fire at the old apartment building 15 years ago. No copies existed anymore. "How do you know about the butterflies?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Emma opened her mouth to answer, but the woman's hand clamped down on her shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "That's enough questions for today," the woman said, and Margaret heard something in her voice that made every teacher's instinct scream danger. "Emma has an appointment we need to get to." Margaret watched, helpless, as they ushered Emma toward the door. But just before they left, the child turned back one last time. "The butterflies remember too," she said simply. "They remember everything." The office door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid in the sudden silence. Margaret stood frozen, staring at the empty space where Emma had been, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The butterfly book. A story destroyed 15 years ago, read to a dying daughter who couldn't possibly have shared it with anyone. Davidson cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the sterile air. "Mrs. Chen, I think we need to discuss some boundaries." But Margaret barely heard him. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorframe, needing something solid to anchor her to reality. Through the office windows, she could see the woman, Mrs. Martinez, though the name felt like another lie, guiding Emma across the parking lot toward a sleek black sedan. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the tension in the child's small frame, the way she moved like someone being led to execution. Margaret Davidson's voice had taken on an edge she'd never heard in their 3 decades of working together. "Are you listening to me?" She turned to face him, noting for the first time how his usually ruddy complexion had gone pale. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the October chill seeping through the windows. His hands, she realized, were shaking almost as badly as her own. Who was that woman? Margaret asked. Emma's adoptive mother, Mrs. Rodriguez Martinez. The family situation is complicated. How complicated? Davidson's jaw worked silently for a moment, and Margaret caught something in his expression that made her stomach clench. Fear, raw, animal fear that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. Complicated enough that certain teachers need to maintain appropriate distance, he said finally. The Martinez family has resources, Margaret, connections. They've made it very clear that Emma's privacy is to be respected. Resources, connections. The words felt heavy with unspoken threat. Margaret had taught in this small town long enough to recognize the careful language people used when money and power were involved. But this felt different, darker. What kind of connections? She pressed. The kind that could make life very difficult for a teacher who doesn't understand her place. Davidson moved to his desk, shuffling papers with unnecessary force. I'm going to pretend this conversation never happened, Margaret, for both our sakes. The dismissal was clear, but Margaret didn't move. Outside, the black sedan was pulling away from the curb, taking Emma with it. In the backseat window, she caught a glimpse of a small face turned toward the school, watching until the building disappeared from view. How long has Emma been enrolled here? Margaret asked. Margaret. How long, Robert? The use of his first name seemed to startle him. He looked up from his papers, and for a moment she saw past the administrative mask to something underneath. Something terrified. 3 weeks, he said quietly. She transferred from a private facility upstate. Very exclusive. Very expensive. What kind of facility? The kind where they help children with behavioral issues. Behavioral issues. Margaret thought of the pill bottle, the woman's clinical efficiency, Emma's desperate insistence about her real home. None of it felt like typical behavioral problems. Have you met the father? Davidson's hands stilled on his paperwork. There is no father in the picture. Adoptive father? Guardian? Just Mrs. Martinez. And her associates. Associates. Margaret filed that away with all the other careful euphemisms Davidson seemed determined to use. What kind of associates? The kind who make generous donations to school districts, Davidson said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The kind who can arrange for new technology labs and updated textbooks and early retirement packages for teachers who ask too many questions. The threat hung between them like smoke. Margaret felt 31 years of job security crumbling beneath her feet, but something stronger was driving her now. Emma's voice. You always promised to find me. I need to get back to my classroom, Margaret said finally. Davidson nodded, relief flooding his features. Good, good. And Margaret? Emma won't be in school for the rest of the week. Family obligations. Family obligations that required medication and restraining hands, and the kind of fear that made grown men sweat in air-conditioned offices. Margaret nodded and left, but her mind was already racing ahead, trying to piece together fragments that didn't want to fit. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Mrs. Patterson, who was emerging from the supply closet with an armful of manila folders. The nurse's usual smile faltered when she saw Margaret's expression. Everything all right, dear? Fine, Margaret lied, noting how Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted toward the office windows before settling back on her face. Just a long morning. Mrs. Patterson nodded, but her grip on the folders tightened. Children can be so challenging sometimes, especially the ones with active imaginations. Another careful phrase, another warning wrapped in concern. Margaret forced a smile and headed for the stairwell, feeling eyes on her back with every step. By the time she reached her empty classroom, one thing had become crystal clear. Everyone was afraid of Emma Martinez. The question was why. Margaret's classroom felt like a mausoleum when she finally reached it. 24 empty desks arranged in neat rows, bulletin boards bright with October leaves and spelling words, the familiar scent of chalk dust and childhood. Everything exactly as she'd left it that morning, when her biggest concern had been whether Tommy Chen would remember his multiplication tables. That felt like a lifetime ago. She sank into her desk chair, her legs finally giving out under the weight of what she'd witnessed. The pill bottle. Emma's desperate voice. Davidson's terror. Each piece circled in her mind like vultures, waiting to pick apart the last of her sanity. On her desk, yesterday's lesson plans mocked her with their normalcy. Reading, Charlotte's Web, Chapter 3, Math, 2-digit addition with regrouping, Science, butterfly life cycles. Her pen had frozen over that last entry. She'd planned to introduce the unit next week, but now the words felt like an accusation. The butterflies remember too. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened her desk drawer, pushing past rubber bands and paper clips to find the folder she'd hidden there 15 years ago. Inside, a single photograph, Sarah at 18 months, laughing in Margaret's arms in front of their old apartment building, the building that had burned down in 2008, taking with it the last physical remnants of her daughter's brief life, including the butterfly book. Margaret stared at Sarah's face, round cheeks, bright eyes, hair that caught sunlight like spun gold. Nothing like Emma's delicate features, nothing like the child who somehow knew about a story that died with its only audience. It was impossible, insane. So why did her heart insist otherwise? A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway, her usual maternal warmth replaced by something cautious and calculating. "May I come in?" Margaret slipped the photograph back into its folder, pulse hammering. "Of course." Patterson closed the door behind her, unusual for the nurse, who typically believed in open doors and transparent communication. She moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the parking lot where the black sedan had disappeared. "They're gone," she said quietly. "I can see that." Patterson turned, and Margaret was startled by the exhaustion in her eyes. "How much did you hear in Davidson's office?" "Enough." Margaret stood, crossing to where Patterson waited by the window. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" "Don't." Margaret's voice came out sharper than intended. "Don't give me another careful non-answer. That child is in danger, and everyone in this building knows it." Patterson's shoulders sagged. She reached into her cardigan pocket and withdrew a small notebook, the kind she usually used for tracking student medications and injury reports. Her fingers shook as she opened it. 3 weeks, she said. "That's how long I've been documenting the bruises." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Show me." The notebook's pages were filled with Patterson's careful nursing notes, dated entries that painted a picture of systematic abuse. October 3rd, finger-shaped bruises on upper arms. Student claims she fell. October 7th, injection site on left shoulder, professionally administered. October 12th, student appeared heavily sedated, pupils dilated. "My God," Margaret whispered. "There's more." Patterson flipped to a page near the back. "Yesterday I tried to take photographs, for evidence." The page showed blurred images. Emma turning away from the camera, a woman's hand blocking the lens, Davidson's face tight with warning. But one photo had captured something that made Margaret's knees go weak. Emma's forearm, where a series of small, round scars formed a pattern like constellation. Burn marks, cigarettes maybe, or something worse. "I've seen this before," Patterson said, her voice hollow. "In my nursing training, we learned to recognize the signs, but never in a school, never with the administration's full knowledge. Davidson knows?" "Davidson's terrified. They own him, Margaret. Whoever these people are, they've got him completely under their thumb." Patterson closed the notebook, her hands still shaking. 3 weeks ago, he called me into his office, told me Emma Martinez would be enrolling, that she had special medical needs that required discretion, said if anyone asked questions about her condition, I was to refer them directly to him. What kind of special needs? Psychiatric medication, daily injections, and this. Patterson pulled a sealed envelope from her other pocket. Emergency contact information. Look at the address. Margaret opened the envelope, scanning the official-looking documents inside. The address listed for Emma's family was a post office box in Albany. The emergency contact was a Dr. Elizabeth Kane at something called the Riverside Research Foundation. "I've never heard of this foundation," Margaret said. Neither had I, so I looked it up. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper. "It doesn't exist, not anymore. The license was revoked 5 years ago for conducting unauthorized medical experiments on minors." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Medical experiments on children. She thought of Emma's desperate voice. "I want to go home. My real home. We have to call someone," Margaret said. "Child services, the police?" "With what evidence? A few bruises and a suspicious address?" Patterson shook her head. "I tried, Margaret. 2 weeks ago I called the state hotline. The case was closed within hours. Insufficient evidence, they said. No follow-up required. That's impossible." "Is it?" Patterson moved closer to the window, watching the empty street as if expecting the black sedan's return. "When was the last time you saw a case dismissed that quickly? When was the last time a child welfare investigation died before it started?" Margaret's mind raced through the implications. Money, connections, the kind of power that could make inconvenient questions disappear. "There's something else," Patterson said. "Something that's going to sound crazy." Margaret almost laughed. After the morning she'd had, nothing could sound crazy anymore. Yesterday, when Emma was in my office for her medication, she was looking at my nursing school graduation photo, class of '85. She pointed to one of the faces and said, "She was nice to me when I was in the hospital." Maybe she recognized someone from another facility. Margaret Patterson's voice was barely audible. "The person she pointed to has been dead for 20 years. The blood drained from Margaret's face as the full implications crashed over her. Emma recognizing dead nurses, knowing about destroyed books, speaking with the voice of someone far older than 8 years. The careful choreography of fear surrounding her, Davidson's terror, the mysterious foundation, the systematic silencing of anyone who asked questions. "Who?" Margaret whispered. "Who did she point to?" Patterson's hands fumbled with the envelope, pulling out a faded photograph. 20-something nursing graduates in white caps and starched uniforms, frozen in time with hopeful smiles. Patterson's finger trembled as it settled on a face in the back row, Rebecca Winters. She worked pediatric oncology at Albany Medical before the accident. Margaret stared at the young woman in the photograph. Kind eyes, gentle smile, the sort of face that would comfort frightened children in hospital beds. What happened to her? Car crash in 2003. Single vehicle accident on Route 9. Patterson's voice was mechanical, reciting facts to avoid drowning in their impossibility. She was driving home from a late shift. They said she fell asleep at the wheel. They said. Another careful phrase in a conversation full of them. Margaret's mind raced, connecting dots that shouldn't connect, forming a picture that defied every rational thought she'd ever had. "Patterson." Her voice came out strangled. "What if she didn't fall asleep?" The nurse went very still. "What are you suggesting? What if Rebecca found something she wasn't supposed to find? What if she started asking the wrong questions about the wrong children?" Margaret's pulse hammered against her temples. "You said the Riverside Research Foundation was shut down for medical experiments. When?" Patterson's face went gray. 2004, a year after Rebecca died. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Through the window, Margaret could see normal suburban life continuing, crossing guards helping children, parents walking dogs, the afternoon sun painting everything golden and safe. It felt like watching the world through bulletproof glass. "There's something else," Margaret said slowly. "Something I haven't told you." She pulled out Sarah's photograph, her daughter's laughing face blurred by decades of handling. Patterson studied it with professional interest until Margaret spoke the words that changed everything. "This is my daughter, Sarah. She died 39 years ago at Albany Medical. Pediatric cancer ward." Patterson's breath caught. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you'd—" She was 18 months old, the same age Emma would have been in another life. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she touched the photograph. "The night before Sarah died, I read to her from a book about monarch butterflies. It was the only thing that calmed her when the pain got bad. I must have read it 50 times that last night." Understanding dawned in Patterson's eyes, followed quickly by fear. The book Emma mentioned. No one else knew about it. The nurses were busy with other patients. Her father had already left. It was just Sarah and me and that damn book about butterflies who remembered their journeys across impossible distances. Margaret's voice cracked. "When she died, I donated everything, clothes, toys, books. I couldn't bear to keep any of it. Patterson sank into one of the student chairs, her face pale. You think Emma somehow... I think Emma Martinez isn't who they say she is. The words tumbled out, carrying with them 39 years of buried grief and desperate hope. I think she's connected to whatever happened at that research facility, and I think they're using her for something that requires keeping her drugged, isolated, and afraid. But Margaret, what you're suggesting is impossible. Children don't just... don't they? Margaret moved to the window, staring at the empty street where the black sedan had disappeared. What if the Riverside Foundation wasn't just experimenting on living children? What if they were trying to document something else? Something about consciousness, memory, the things that make us who we are. The question hung in the air like smoke. Patterson's medical training warred visibly with what she'd witnessed. The scars, the terror, the systematic cover-up that reached into every corner of their small world. You're talking about reincarnation, Patterson said finally. I'm talking about a child who knows things she shouldn't know, recognizes people she's never met, and speaks about memories that belong to someone else. Margaret turned back to her colleague, a child who makes powerful people very, very nervous. Patterson stood abruptly, her nurse's instincts taking over. If you're right, if any of this is real, then Emma is in more danger than we imagined. Because they know what she is? No. Patterson's voice was grim. Because they created what she is, and now they're trying to control it. Through the classroom window, a black sedan turned onto the street, moving slowly like a predator hunting familiar territory. Both women stepped back from the glass, hearts pounding in synchrony. Davidson's earlier words echoed in Margaret's mind, the kind who can arrange for early retirement packages for teachers who ask too many questions. She was about to ask a lot more questions. The black sedan made 3 slow passes before disappearing again, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun like dead eyes. Margaret and Patterson remained frozen by the classroom window until the street fell silent, each understanding they'd crossed into territory from which there was no safe return. We can't stay here, Patterson whispered, her nurse's training warring with an instinct older than medicine. If they know we're talking. They already know. Margaret's voice carried the weight of 31 years teaching children to read the truth behind adult lies. The question is what we do about it. Patterson clutched her notebook tighter. What can we do? You said it yourself. They have Davidson terrified. They shut down investigations before they start. They make inconvenient people disappear. Like Rebecca Winters. The thought hung unspoken between them, heavy with implication. Margaret studied Sarah's photograph one more time before sliding it back into the folder. Her daughter's face seemed to plead with her across decades of silence. I need to see Emma, Margaret said. Tonight. Margaret, no. You heard Davidson. Family obligations. They've taken her somewhere we can't reach. Then I'll reach further. Margaret moved to her desk, pulling out a worn address book that predated smartphones and digital efficiency. Her fingers found the entry she'd avoided for 15 years. Linda Morrison, Child Services, Personal. Patterson read over her shoulder. You know someone at the state? Linda processed Sarah's case when she died. Helped me navigate the legal paperwork, the medical examiner's requirements. Margaret's throat tightened with memory. She also handled Sarah's father when he tried to claim insurance money 3 years later. Linda doesn't tolerate people who hurt children. That was decades ago. She might not even... She's still there, still fighting the same battles. Margaret had followed Linda's career through newspaper articles and professional newsletters, drawing strange comfort from knowing someone continued the fight she'd abandoned. If anyone can cut through the bureaucracy around Emma's case, it's Linda. Patterson paced to the window and back, her medical mind cataloging risks like symptoms. What if you're wrong? What if Emma really is just a disturbed child whose mother happens to have connections? The question struck at Margaret's deepest fear, that grief had finally driven her to see patterns where none existed. But then she remembered Emma's voice, ancient and weary. The butterflies remembered too. Then a little girl goes back to being drugged and burned and controlled by people who view her as an experiment. Margaret picked up her phone. Linda's number committed to memory like a prayer. I can live with being wrong. I can't live with being right and doing nothing. Patterson stopped pacing. What do you need me to do? The simple question nearly broke Margaret's resolve. After 31 years of professional caution, someone was finally willing to step into the fire beside her. Keep documenting everything. Every visit from that woman. Every time Davidson acts strange. Every black sedan that circles our school. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. And watch the other children. If Emma isn't the only one, you think there are others? I think the Riverside Foundation didn't shut down because they got caught. I think they shut down because they succeeded. Margaret dialed Linda's number, her hands steadier than they'd been all day. And I think we're about to find out what they created. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, gravelly from decades of courthouse coffee and bureaucratic battles. Morrison. Linda, it's Margaret Chen, from Albany Medical, 1985. Sarah Chen's mother. A pause, then warmth flooding the connection. Margaret, my God, it's been years. How are you holding up? I need your help, Linda. There's a child. Margaret's voice cracked despite her resolve. There's a child who reminds me of Sarah. The warmth vanished, replaced by the steel that had made Linda Morrison legendary among child advocates. Tell me everything. As Margaret spoke about Emma's terror, Davidson's fear, the Foundation's dark history, she watched Patterson continue her vigil at the window. The nurse had positioned herself where she could see both the street and the hallway, her body language speaking of someone prepared for siege. Margaret, Linda's voice cut through her narrative. I'm going to ask you something, and I need absolute honesty. Are you calling because you genuinely believe this child is in danger, or because you see your daughter in her? The question hung between them like a blade. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. Both, she whispered. And I'm terrified that might be the same thing. Stay where you are. I'm driving up tonight. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone while Patterson kept watch at the window. Outside, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business, oblivious to the extraordinary darkness gathering at the edges of their small sanctuary. They'd made their choice. Now they could only wait to see what chose them in return. Margaret set her phone down with trembling fingers, the silence after Linda's call feeling like the held breath before an avalanche. Patterson remained at the window, her nurse's instincts mapping every shadow that moved across the empty street. How long do we have? Patterson asked. 3 hours, maybe 4 if traffic cooperates. Margaret began gathering the scattered documents, Emma's falsified records, the Foundation's history, Patterson's careful notes about bruises and needles. But I don't think we can wait for Linda. As if summoned by her words, footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond. Not the familiar shuffle of evening custodial staff, but the measured stride of someone with purpose. Both women froze as the steps grew closer, stopping just outside Margaret's classroom door. 3 soft knocks. A pause. Then Principal Davidson's voice, strained and hollow. Margaret, I know you're in there. We need to talk. Patterson's hand moved instinctively to her notebook, clutching it like a lifeline. Margaret approached the door but didn't open it, her teacher's intuition screaming warnings she'd learned to trust over 3 decades of reading the spaces between words. About what, Jim? About the questions you've been asking. About Emma Martinez. His voice cracked on the child's name. Please, let me explain before it's too late. Margaret exchanged glances with Patterson, seeing her own fear reflected in the nurse's pale face. Too late for whom? But something in Davidson's tone, desperation rather than threat, made her turn the lock. Davidson stepped inside and immediately closed the door behind him, his face gaunt with exhaustion. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for human shoulders. You have to stop, he said without preamble. Both of you. Whatever you think you know about that child, whatever theories you're building, you have to let it go, like Rebecca Winters let it go. The question escaped before Margaret could stop it. Davidson's face went chalk white. How do you know about Rebecca? She was asking questions too, wasn't she? About the Foundation, about the children they were taking. Margaret felt pieces clicking together with terrible clarity. What happened to her, really? Davidson sank into one of the student chairs, his large frame looking grotesquely out of place among the tiny desks. For a moment, he looked older than his 58 years, aged by secrets that had consumed him from within. "Rebecca was my sister," he whispered. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Patterson gasped audibly, while Margaret struggled to process the connections forming in her mind. A nurse who discovered something terrible, a brother who became principal of a school where impossible children appeared decades later. "She called me the night she died," Davidson continued, his voice mechanical with old grief. "Told me she'd found something at Albany Medical, files about children who died in the cancer ward but whose bodies showed signs of revival. Cellular regeneration that couldn't be explained by medical science." Margaret's legs gave out. She gripped the edge of her desk as Sarah's face flashed before her eyes, pale and still in the hospital bed, then mysteriously warm when Margaret had returned from signing the final papers. The nurses had claimed it was normal, body temperature regulation after death. But Sarah's eyes had been open. Sarah's eyes had been looking at her. The Foundation was studying near-death experiences in terminally ill children, Davidson said. But they weren't just studying them, they were inducing them, killing children clinically, then reviving them to see what came back. Patterson's medical training kicked in through her horror. That's impossible. The brain damage alone would normally be catastrophic, yes. But these children were different afterward. They remembered things they shouldn't remember, spoke in languages they'd never learned, drew pictures of places they'd never been. Davidson's voice grew smaller with each revelation, and sometimes they remembered being other children entirely. Margaret found her voice. "Sarah, your daughter was one of the first successful cases. She died, was revived, died again, but something essential survived the process, something that could transfer." Davidson looked directly at her, his eyes filled with desperate apology. "Emma Martinez isn't just any child, Margaret. She's carrying your daughter's memories, your daughter's consciousness. The Foundation has been tracking her for 8 years, studying her, trying to replicate what makes her special." The room spun around Margaret as 39 years of grief collided with impossible hope. Sarah was dead. Sarah had been dead for decades. But somehow, impossibly, Sarah was also alive in the terrified little girl they'd been drugging and burning and controlling. "That's why they're here," she whispered. "Not to study her anymore. To retrieve her." Davidson nodded miserably. "Tomorrow night, they're taking her to a facility upstate where they can complete their research without interference." "What research?" Patterson demanded. "They want to extract the consciousness, transfer it to a more manageable subject." Davidson's voice broke completely. "They're going to destroy Emma to save whatever part of Sarah they can isolate." Margaret felt something ancient and fierce unfurl in her chest, the protective fury of a mother whose child was threatened, amplified by decades of suppressed grief and guilt. "No," she said simply. "Margaret, you don't understand the power these people have." "No, Jim, you don't understand." She stood slowly, feeling strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "I lost Sarah once. I won't lose her again." The safe house Linda Morrison had arranged sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by tall pines that whispered secrets in the November wind. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Emma trace patterns in the condensation on the glass, not the random marks of a child, but deliberate symbols that seemed to hold meaning beyond her young hand's ability to create. 3 weeks had passed since they'd fled Riverside Elementary in the dead of night, Linda's connections in child services cutting through red tape with surgical precision. The Foundation's facility upstate had been raided 2 days later, its files seized, its researchers arrested. Principal Davidson, Jim, was cooperating fully with federal investigators, his guilt transformed into something useful at last. But Emma still woke screaming. "The dreams are getting clearer," Patterson said quietly, settling into the chair beside Margaret. She'd taken leave from the school to help with Emma's medical care, documenting the child's gradual healing with the same careful attention she'd once given to cataloging her injuries. Margaret nodded, watching Emma's small fingers complete another symbol, a butterfly with wings that stretched beyond the window's frame. She told me yesterday that the lady in the pictures has a name now. Sarah? Sarah. The word came easier each time Margaret spoke it, like a prayer finally answered after decades of silence. She says Sarah wants to tell her things, but the telling makes Emma's head hurt. They'd learned that two consciousnesses sharing one small body created friction, memories bleeding through at unexpected moments, emotional responses that belonged to someone else, knowledge that arrived without context or warning. The Foundation's drugs had suppressed this natural overflow, keeping Sarah's presence manageable but trapped. Now, without chemical restraints, Emma was becoming someone new entirely. Neither fully the 8-year-old girl who'd sobbed in the school bathroom, nor completely the daughter Margaret had lost, but something precious and impossible balanced between both worlds. Mrs. Chen? Emma turned from the window, her dark eyes holding depths that made Margaret's breath catch. Sometimes she saw her own stubborn curiosity reflected there, genetic echoes that transcended death itself. Sarah wants to show you something. Margaret knelt beside the child, heart racing as it did every time Emma spoke of her daughter in present tense. What does she want to show me? Emma reached into her pocket and withdrew the silver locket. Margaret's locket, lost 39 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and dying hope. The child's fingers worked at the clasp with practiced ease, revealing the photograph Margaret had forgotten was there, herself at 17, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. She says to tell you she understands now, about the giving away, about the loving from far places. Emma's voice carried inflections that didn't belong to her generation, word choices that spoke of an older soul looking through younger eyes. She says you were just a baby too, making baby choices with a baby heart. Tears Margaret thought she'd exhausted weeks ago rose fresh and clean. For 39 years, she'd carried the guilt of giving Sarah up for adoption, of choosing her own future over her daughter's needs. The cancer had come later, after Sarah's adoptive parents had already opened their hearts to the difficult baby who cried too much and slept too little. She forgives me? Emma smiled, Sarah's smile, Margaret realized with a start. The same lopsided grin that had made nurses laugh despite their exhaustion. She says forgiveness is for things that need forgiving. Love doesn't need forgiving. Love just needs remembering. Patterson wiped her eyes, her medical training finally surrendering to mysteries that textbooks couldn't explain. They'd all been changed by the impossible truth of Emma's existence, that consciousness could survive death, that love could transcend the boundaries between one life and another, that sometimes the universe offered second chances to those brave enough to recognize them. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling something she hadn't experienced since she was 17 years old, peace. Not the brittle control she'd maintained through decades of teaching other people's children, but genuine serenity born of understanding that some losses weren't permanent, some goodbyes weren't final. When she opened her eyes, Emma was watching her with expression both ancient and innocent. "What happens now?" Margaret whispered. "Now we learn to be a family," Emma said, her voice purely her own for the first time since Margaret had found her crying in the school bathroom. "Sarah says it's what she always wanted, to come home to you, even if home looks different than anyone expected." Outside the window, the November wind scattered leaves like promises across the frozen ground. Margaret pulled Emma close, marveling at how perfectly the child fit against her shoulder, as if some part of her had always been waiting for this moment, this impossible gift wrapped in grief and tied with wonder. She'd lost a daughter and found her again in the most unlikely place, the frightened eyes of a little girl who remembered love that death couldn't erase. It was, Margaret thought, exactly the kind of miracle that would stay with someone forever.